And for more details on Saudi Arabia deploying its fighter jets in Turkey, Gulnur Aybet joins me now in the studio. She's the director of Centre for Security Studies at Istanbul Bahçeşehir University. Thank you very much for your time. Now, Gulnur, quite a dramatic escalation in just the last hour. Reports that Turkey has started operations in Syria. Can you tell us a bit about it, perhaps what exactly they're targeting?
Well, as you know, there's this corridor, what is called the Azaz corridor, that is controlled by the opposition forces, and that corridor is in danger of becoming narrowed now, since the Russian airstrikes recently have cut off access from Turkey to Aleppo. That's where the supplies were going through from that corridor. And it's also this corridor where all the refugees have started to flow in from Aleppo. Now, on one side of it, you have PYD, the Kurdish fighting force in Syria, which is closely affiliated with the PKK. And in fact, the Turkish government have said they don't see any difference between the YPG and the fighting force there, the Kurdish force, and the PKK. This has led to somewhat of a rift between two allies, the US and Turkey. On the other side of that corridor is ISIS. Now, Turkey has two strategic aims here. First of all, as a tactical move, they would not want the YPG forces to cross west of the Euphrates, and they've already said that that's a red line. And I think the current shelling of, it hasn't been confirmed, by the way, but we're hearing reports about it. The current shelling of YPG forces is precisely because of that. But also there's a long-term strategy here. But this morning I've been listening very closely also to all that's been happening at the Munich Security Conference. Although the major players here, the regional powers and the big superpowers, Russia and the United States, are not exactly on the same page, but we're coming closer to an understanding that there's likely to be some kind of partition in Syria between Alawite, Sunni and Kurdish areas. The question where people don't agree is how much land should each of these components get? What should be the final map? And we're in that stage where, unfortunately, we were over Bosnia all those years ago when, the reality on the ground finally determined the map. In this case, Turkey's other red line, the more sort of strategic thing, would be the absolute no to a geographically contiguous zone across the entire Turkish border controlled by the YPG. Hence, they would not want that corridor to fall into the hands of the YPG alone. So I think, there are two strategic considerations here that Turkey's interested in.
Okay, so I understand the Azaz corridor, but why exactly now? Things have been building for some time, but why has it come to this point of making the decision today? Because, well, a variety of reasons that have all converged together. I mean, we didn't really expect Russia to become such an adamant player in the field, and they have. And the Russians know that they can't really stay in the theatre of war for very long. Therefore, whatever they do, they have to do it very quickly and try to establish some kind of reality on the ground that they're going to be comfortable with. And of course, they're supporting the Assad regime, and they're bombing the opposition forces rather than ISIS. With all this happening, the Americans have also come on board with the Russians to say, let's at least try to get some humanitarian aid through to the besieged cities and agree on a cessation of hostilities, which they did at Munich yesterday. But it's going to be difficult also for that to be implemented because, again, there are differences. So all of these things coming together has actually sort of accelerated, if you like, both the regional and the Russian-American initiatives in the area. That there seems to be an intention to find out what the reality on the ground is going to be sooner than later. So there's an acceleration in fighting, unfortunately, which is leading to a lot of suffering. And also there's an acceleration in very tough negotiations. And Assad has given a special interview yesterday, and he said that he's adamant to clear all of Syria and get all the land back entirely controlled by himself. And then the US State Department spokesman said that that would be delusional. So obviously the United States and Assad are not on the same page. Assad has also said there's no need for ground forces. The Russians have already said that, but now we hear that the US is backing special forces of the UAE and Saudi to go into areas like Raqqa.
And again, there's a reason behind that, because if you're going to replace ISIS with some other Sunni entity there, to have some kind of legitimacy to do that, you're going to start off with Sunni special forces in the area. So hence the acceleration of everything.
Gulnur, thanks very much for that deep analysis there. In the last few hours, the Turkish military has shelled Kurdish terrorist YPG positions inside Syria. Reports suggest the shelling has been concentrated around the town of Azaz, north of Aleppo. An airbase and a village captured from insurgents by the YPG was reportedly targeted. For more on this development, Gulnur Aybet joins me now in the studio. She's the Director of Centre for Security Studies at Istanbul's Bahçeşehir University. Gulnur, thank you for your time. A fairly dramatic escalation here. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening, why and where they are targeting?
Well, this is a corridor known as the Azaz corridor that's been held by opposition forces. On one side there's PYD forces, the Kurdish Syrian forces, and on the other side there's ISIS. So, and access of Turkish supplies to Aleppo have been cut off last week when the Russians bombed and cleared the way for these Assad forces to take these two villages there. So there's also a flow of refugees there. But Turkey has always maintained a red line that the YPG forces should not cross west of the Euphrates. Hence, in order to circumvent that, hence the shelling is happening, because the YPG are working very closely with the PKK terrorist organization, which is already a serious security threat to Turkey.
Only 2 days ago, the world powers agreed to a temporary break in fighting. Why is Turkey acting now specifically? What is the strategy in this operation?
Well, what's happening actually now with the cessation of hostilities, they call it not exactly a ceasefire, it's expected to be in place in a week, so it hasn't been, and we don't even know if the Assad regime has agreed to it. That's why they're continuing with their bombing. The Russians and the Americans have agreed to this, but it doesn't mean that forces on the ground will be ceasing hostilities. The whole point is to allow some UN humanitarian aid to get through to the besieged areas. But we've seen this sort of thing happen before in the Bosnian War, where you had limited strips of land where aid convoys were allowed to get through, but as long as the killing didn't stop, people were then clamoring on the UN trucks saying, we don't really want the aid, we just want the killing to stop and get out of here. So it could be a complete mess like that once the aid goes through without combat operations on the ground entirely come to an end. And of course, the whole point of the cessation of hostilities is you need all of the forces on the ground to agree, and that's not very likely to happen, as we can see. And also, although they've agreed to this in principle, Russia and the United States are not on the same page either. So what's happening now is, I think the only thing that there is some kind of agreement about is that eventually, if there is a settlement, there'll be a three-way partition and some kind of confederal system between a Kurdish area, a Sunni area, an Alawite area. But that's why at the moment the fighting has become very ferocious on all sides, because everybody wants to determine what's called the reality on the ground that will make the final map. And I think for Turkey, the long-term strategic aim is to prevent a geographically contiguous zone controlled by the YPG all across the Turkish border.
But why exactly now? I mean, things have been happening in the same sort of pattern for the last few weeks now, but it seems like Turkey has made a snap decision. What is it about this particular day that's changed
this particular day? Well, I mean, it's coming on the heel of a US-Russia agreement, and obviously Russia has become quite a formidable force in the Syrian theater of war, paving the way for Assad forces to make gains in a way that they haven't been able to make in the last 4 years of the war. So obviously you can see that the situation on the ground is being shaped and altered by all those who are involved in the war. And if Turkey sits back and allows things to just happen on its border, then whatever situation emerges out of this on the border is going to be something that Turkey has to live with when other forces leave the area. So obviously they want to make sure that that geographically contiguous zone of YPG does not emerge on the Turkish border. But like I said, I mean, the cessation of hostilities, it's not very clear even if we're going to be able to get something on the ground, or if the UN is going to be able to access these areas.
Okay, Gulnur, thank you very much for that insight there. Very interesting indeed. And also